it's clear that we've lost. We have failed to achieve our goals, and worse. And this is reflected in the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding. As I said to you, if you look carefully at that memorandum, it's a surrender document. So what is President Trump going to do now? Now, I would point out that when it comes to President Trump, you can never be absolutely certain what he will do. And in a situation where he's desperate, and he is desperate because he is surely sophisticated enough to know that he is in deep trouble in this war and that he has in effect lost the war. So he may lash out and he may do something foolish. But assuming that's not the case, he really has no choice at this point but to pursue another memorandum of understanding, to try to get a deal with the Iranians as quickly as possible. I want to point out two things here. One is, President Trump would have been much better off cutting a deal immediately after the April 8th ceasefire. When the bombing campaign failed, the discriminate air campaign failed, on April 8th he moved to a ceasefire. He should have then tried to cut a deal.
Every war reaches a point where leaders must decide whether to escalate or admit the original strategy isn't working. According to John Mearsheimer, that moment has already arrived. He argues the United States failed to achieve its original objectives, exhausted every realistic military option, and now has fewer choices than ever before. Whether you agree or disagree, his conclusion is one of the boldest assessments of this conflict.
When the war started, the United States, and this was true of the Israelis as well, had four goals. The first goal was regime change in Tehran. The second goal was to make sure to eliminate Iran's ability to enrich uranium, because if you can enrich uranium, you can rather easily make a nuclear weapon. The third goal was to eliminate Ukraine's long-range ballistic missile program. And the fourth goal was to basically get Iran to no longer support Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Those were the four goals. And very importantly, I think regime change was the most important of those four goals, because if you didn't achieve regime change, you really could not achieve the other three goals. So regime change was the numero uno goal, but you still had these three other very important goals that were, in my opinion, subordinated to that overarching goal. Now, the question you want to ask yourself is, where are we today in terms of those goals? And let me make two different sets of arguments here. First of all, just looking at the four goals. We have achieved none of the four goals. None of them have been achieved, and there's no evidence any of them are going to be achieved anytime soon. In addition to that, we are now in a situation which we were not in back on February 27th, the day before the war started, where Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz, and today, as we speak, has shut off the flow of traffic in and out of the Strait of Hormuz. Furthermore, on February 27th, the day before the war, the United States had a robust alliance structure with the Gulf states in the region, and it had a serious set of military bases in the region. Today, those bases have been either badly damaged or destroyed, and the alliance structure that the United States had with the Gulf states has been basically torn to tatters. To take this a step further, the international economy, because of the blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, is in a very dangerous situation, and there is a real risk of a worldwide depression if this war is not settled sometime soon. And then finally, I would note that China, which is America's principal adversary, according to The Trump administration has benefited enormously from this conflict.
Mearsheimer begins by asking a simple question. Did the original objective succeed? His answer is no. He argues the conflict not only failed to achieve those goals, but also created new strategic and economic challenges.
If you look at the memorandum of understanding that President Trump signed with the Iranians on June 17th of this year, this memorandum of understanding was designed to shut the war down. What you see is that that was basically a surrender document. President Trump basically conceded every point that was at issue between the Iranians and the Americans. The way the document was set up, this is the Memorandum of Understanding, is that we would have a ceasefire up front. The fighting would stop, and the Strait of Hormuz would be opened up. And furthermore, the Iranians would be able to sell oil on the open markets, which had not been the case before the June 17th Memorandum of Understanding was signed. They could sell oil without having to worry about American sanctions. That was the first part of the agreement. Again, to get a ceasefire, number one, and number two, to open up the strait. Then there would be a 60-day negotiating period, and at the end of that 60-day negotiating period, there would be a decision on the nuclear issue. But it was very clear that the Iranians would maintain a nuclear enrichment capability, which was at odds with one of the goals we had going into the war. Furthermore, it was clear that the United States would have to allow all of those frozen Iranian assets to go back to Iran. And furthermore, reparations would have to be paid to the Iranians for all of the damage that was done to Iran in this war. And an enormous amount of damage was done. So an enormous amount of money would have to be paid to the Iranians. On top of all of this, the Iranians would be able to sell oil freely on world oil markets. So all of this is to say that if you look at the Memorandum of Understanding, the United States conceded on every key issue. The Iranians prevailed. So, in terms of the goals that we went into this war with, we failed to achieve any of them, and we ended up much worse off.
According to Mearsheimer, the negotiations revealed how difficult the situation had become. He argues the agreement reflected major concessions and marked a turning point in the conflict.
Truth is, it just didn't work. There was no evidence as that campaign wore on that the Iranians were going to throw up their hands and surrender. The shock and awe campaign, the decapitation strategy, which came at the beginning, didn't work. And we continued to bomb. Most estimates say that the United States hit over 13,000 targets. You want to think about that. This is not the Israelis. We can't get a good number for the Israelis. But the Americans alone hit 13,000 plus targets in that 40-day campaign. This is a strategic bombing campaign. But the Iranians were not showing any signs of quitting. Furthermore, the Iranians made it perfectly clear during that campaign that they had the ability to retaliate, and retaliate they did. And they were inflicting massive punishment on American bases in the region, on America's Gulf state allies, and on Israel itself. So the Iranians were doing quite well for themselves in the fight, and all the time this is happening, people are deeply worried that if the war goes on and on and on like this, that number one, the United States is going to run out of munitions because we only have a limited number of offensive munitions and defensive munitions to protect ourselves, our allies, and the Israelis against incoming ballistic missiles from Iran. So the inventory of offensive and defensive weapons is being run down. The Iranians show no signs of quitting. And furthermore, they are retaliating in serious ways that threaten the world economy. So what does President Trump do? What President Trump does as we move towards the end of the 40-day war is that he threatens to go to an indiscriminate air campaign. Just think about that. He's thinking about going to an indiscriminate air campaign. He's talking about bombing the Iranians back to the Stone Age because the discriminate air campaign has failed, and he sees this as the best alternative. But what happens is he does not pursue that strategy. He does not. What he does is, after threatening to wipe out the Iranian civilization, he then, the next day, declares a ceasefire. A ceasefire. He doesn't go up the escalation ladder. And the question you want to ask yourself is, why doesn't he do this? And the reason he doesn't do this is because the United States does not have escalation dominance. We've learned this in the 40-day war. The fact is that if President Trump goes to an indiscriminate campaign, that means he's going to hit bridges, he's going to hit power plants, he's going to hit desalination plants inside of Iran, he's going to hit their oil facilities, he's going to destroy their oil and gas facilities. The Iranians make it clear they're going to do the same thing to all the Gulf states. And they're going to do a lot of the same thing to Israel itself. And President Trump understands full well he cannot prevent this. He understands that as he goes up the escalation ladder, the Iranians will go up the escalation ladder with him. And you want to remember that if, in the event this were to happen, and the Iranians were to destroy all of those desalination plants in the Gulf states and their oil and gas infrastructure, this would have devastating consequences for the international economy. And that's the last thing that President Trump wants to have. So you see, it makes no sense to go up the escalation ladder. This is why an indiscriminate air campaign makes no sense. And it's why the next day, after making those genocidal threats on April 7th, he goes to a ceasefire on the 8th. And the ceasefire is followed by negotiations, as I said, in Islamabad. This is where Vice President Vance meets with Iranian negotiators. That fails, and he has to do something. So what does he do? Does he go back to the air war? No. He sticks with the ceasefire, but he employs a blockade.
This is the core of the interview. Mearsheimer argues that once the initial military strategy failed to produce its intended political outcome, every remaining option became increasingly costly and less likely to succeed.
President Trump signs the Memorandum of Understanding, and as I made clear at the top of the show, that's a surrender document. Okay, after President Trump signs that agreement, he can't bring himself to stick to it. The thought of the United States losing, the thought of Donald Trump losing a war that he started to Iran is just unacceptable. So he begins to challenge, to undermine the Memorandum of Understanding. He begins to look for ways to put pressure on the Iranians, again, to get the Iranians to throw their hands up. And this is the start of the tit-for-tat campaign, right? As I said to you, as soon as the Americans established this channel in the Strait of Hormuz, contrary to what's in Article 5 of the Memorandum of Understanding, the Iranians start shooting at ships that are going through that channel. We retaliate with air attacks, and the Iranians then retaliate against us, and of course we retaliate, they retaliate, and we're going up the escalation ladder. But it's just tit for tat. And what you want to understand here is that a tit for tat air strategy is much less ambitious than that strategic bombing campaign that we waged during the first 40 days of the conflict.